Good afternoon. My name is Dave Douglas, and it's my pleasure to serve as Dean of the Law School here at the College of William & Mary, and I'd like to welcome all of you here to today's program on free speech under fire. And we're broadcasting here from the Mason School of Business at the College of William & Mary, and we have some folks who are online with us today, and I wanted to point out that hashtag WM Free Speech is the way in which you can engage with us if you are online and not in the room with us today. Let me say a little bit about free speech as a setup for today's program. If you think about our essence as Americans, what defines us as Americans in our history and our culture and our common sensibility, one of the factors that would be quite central, I think, for us is we are a nation with a particularly robust commitment to freedom of speech and the corollary, freedom of the press. And this is central to our sensibility. Now, why is that? Why did we historically develop this? Come back with me, if you will, to the 1780s. After our independence, here, we have formed a government called the Articles of Confederation. But the Articles of Confederation don't work. They do not provide enough centralized organization. And the framers realized we're going to have more centralization. We're going to have a new government with greater centralization of authority in the legislature and the executive. But we have a problem, because all of us were familiar with what happened when it was life under the crown and life under the British Parliament. And we don't want to go back to that. We are very skeptical about centralized authority. And that's one of the animating principles of the framing of our Constitution, is how do we have enough centralized authority to function as a government, but by the same token protect us from the abuses we experienced under the British. Well, one of the ways we dealt with this is we made sure that there would be a Bill of Rights included in the Constitution. So we would give this power to the executive. We would give this power to the Congress. But the Bill of Rights provided certain restraints on the exercise of that power, and Bill of Right number 1, the First Amendment, begins with the protection of freedom of speech and the freedom of the press, and that this would become an important bulwark against the abuse of centralized power. And that sets the framework to some extent. We're going to hear more about this in a few minutes, but this sets the framework to some extent about the importance of freedom of speech in our society. There was another bit of thinking about freedom of speech, is if speech is robust and it's open and the press functions well, we will have a better society, because we will be able to critique the mistakes of the government. We will be able to critique the mistakes of society. And if we can do so in a relatively unfettered way, it will be good for the common weal and good for this experiment in government by the people. Now, all of that sounds very good. But of course, there's a problem with freedom of speech. There's a problem with allowing us as a nation to have very robust speech rights. There's some speech we don't like. There's hate speech. There is denigration of certain ethnic groups or racial groups. So what do we do with this? What do we do with negative speech? Well, you know, it's interesting. Our free speech commitment has been embraced by nations throughout the West. But there is a bit of a difference between the American embrace of free speech and free speech embraced by many other Western nations. And the primary difference is this: we are far more solicitous of permitting what we might call hate speech or negative speech. So, for example, we permitted Nazis to march through a Jewish neighborhood in Illinois. We have permitted Westboro Baptist Church to engage in some of their vile statements at certain funerals, so long as they don't interfere with the funerals. We saw recently at the University of Oklahoma where students would engage in a racist song. Now, it's interesting, as an aside, the students there were expelled by this state university. Many free speech experts will say that may not stand legally, because we're a society that actually permits people to engage in negative speech, hate speech within certain constraints. It's one of the striking features of the American embrace of free speech. Now, where that brings us today, and let me elaborate on that in one way. One of the reasons we're having this conference here today is because with the title, Attacks on Speech, Free Speech Under Fire, is because of what we witnessed in Paris a few months ago with the murder of so many journalists and cartoonists. What's fascinating about that is shortly after those murders, you may remember the common phrase around the world was "Je suis Charlie," a show of support for those who were killed, a show of support for this trampling on speech. Well, there was a political activist in France, and he put on his Facebook page, "Je suis," and he named the name of one of the killers. Put that on his Facebook page. Quite antagonistic, quite unfriendly. And he was arrested for incitement to terrorism. Would not have been arrested in the United States. Why? Because we're going to tolerate negative speech or hate speech much more robustly than will most other nations in the world. But this, of course, does invite problems for us. And I'm sure there are many of us in this room who are a little uncomfortable with how far we allow speech to go. Shouldn't there be some constraints on speech? But we've made the fundamental decision that it is better to have, if you will, too much speech than to allow the government to censor the choices that we make. Now, back to the theme of today, speech under fire. What we're seeing today in the world, in ways we've seen before, but it's been particularly dramatic in recent weeks and recent months, is attacks on freedom of speech and freedom of the press. We see this in the Middle East. We see journalists being brutally murdered by ISIS. We see the attacks in Paris of a few months ago. We see the intimidation of those who want to speak freely. This is an important issue for us in a free society and throughout the world. And that's why we've gathered here today. And we're going to hear from a group of individuals who are going to address this issue of speech in America and speech under fire. And we're going to begin with an elderly gentleman, a rather elderly gentleman. His name is Patrick Henry. In fact, you may have assumed Mr. Henry was no longer with us. Well, he is with us here today. And it's marvelous to begin with Patrick Henry, because if there was anyone in 18th century political culture who understood the efficacy of speech and was very skilled at it, it was Patrick Henry. So Patrick Henry in a few minutes will step up and speak to us about free speech. And then after Patrick Henry, we'll hear from Max Fisher. Max Fisher is a graduate of the College of William & Mary in the class of 2008. He works for Vox, an online news magazine where he primarily covers international matters. He will then be followed by Andy Purdy. Andy Purdy is a cybersecurity specialist. He was chief of cybersecurity under the George W. Bush administration, and now is chief of cybersecurity for one of the largest telecommunications companies in the world. And he's a William & Mary graduate, class of 1973. And then finally, we will hear from Drew Dernovich, William & Mary graduate, class of 1990. Drew Dernovich has the most marvelous job. He draws cartoons for a living, and he does very well. Most of his work is published, or a substantial portion of his work is published in The New Yorker. And of course, how appropriate in this particular context with the Charlie Hebdo event very much in our minds to have Drew with us today. So we have a marvelous group, and each, one after the other, will step up and offer their thoughts on today's topic. Again, I welcome you all for being here. I think you're in for a good time. Thank you very much.
Good morrow, friends and countrymen. Gentlemen and ladies, I am very deeply honored, very much humbled to have this opportunity to address you. Mr. Alexander Finney, the worshipful mayor of Williamsburg City, suggested that I make to you some few brief remarks concerning the matter of free speech. He knows full well that I have never in my life been much known for speaking briefly about anything, but nonetheless, I shall endeavor to the best of my abilities in accordance with his wishes. By way of polite introduction, for those of you who are not yet known to me, my name is Henry, Patrick Henry Jr., Esquire, your most humble and obedient servant to command. And I've just recently received the very high and unmerited honor to be appointed to serve as the first elected governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia. I shall endeavor to serve you diligently and well. I suppose that I am rather well qualified to speak upon this particular topic. I blush to say it, but there are some who refer to me as the Demosthenes of the age, others as the voice of the revolution. Others think of me as nothing more than a firebrand or a demagogue, a hothead. Think what you will. I did not have the opportunity, as so many of my fellow associates did, to attend this grand college of William and Mary. Rather, I was schooled to the classical style at home by my father, Colonel John Henry. He was the first on the Henry side of the family to come to these shores, coming from Aberdeen in Scotland. He came armed with only a classical education and a fierce independency of spirit, which he instilled in me. I learned from a very early age that I, as a British subject living here in Virginia, have a basic, fundamental, inherent natural right, the right to have an opinion and to express it freely. Naturally, there are some limits to this particular freedom. For example, if I happen to notice that Mrs. Randolph is most unbecoming in that green and orange dress, I am very wise. Prudence, in fact, and civilities dictate that I keep my opinion to myself. Likewise, if I should defame a gentleman in a public forum by using what I know to be falsehoods, I subject myself to the very costly litigation of libel or of slander. But friends, things are different when one is speaking about the rights and liberties of the people of Virginia and all America. I consider myself to be the sentinel of the rights and liberties of the people. I speak the voice of thousands, and I did so before I even entered into public life. In December of 1763, I argued a legal cause in Hanover County. Many still speak of it, the Parsons cause. During the course of my haranguing the jury, there were cries of treason. Happily, no charges were brought. That is, after all, a capital offense. But it resulted in a very favorable verdict for the people of Virginia, particularly the small dirt farmers. In fact, shortly following that jury's verdict, I was picked up upon the shoulders of a large number of men and paraded around the courtyard, electioneering style. In the following year, I found myself elected for the first time into the House of Burgesses, representing the good people of Louisa County. I had sworn the oath of office only 8 days prior to introducing my resolutions against the hated Stamp Act. That defense also elicited cries of treason. No charges brought. But I was already distinguishing myself as a rather radical leader as we entered into greater and greater difficulties with our parent country. Some of you have probably heard of an oration I delivered in Richmond Town at the town church. At least you might be familiar with the final sentence, that of liberty or death. But upon the question of free speech, my introduction, I believe, is something that is most suitable to this current discussion. I recall saying, after I was recognized, "No man, Mr. President, thinks more highly than I do of the patriotism as well as the abilities of the very honorable gentlemen who have just addressed this House. But different men often see the same subject in different lights. And therefore, I hope it will not be thought disrespectful of those worthy gentlemen if, entertaining as I do, opinions of a character very opposite to theirs, that I should speak forth my sentiments freely and without reserve. This is no time for ceremony. The question before this House is one of awful moment to the country. For my own part, I consider it as nothing less than a question of freedom or slavery, and in proportion to the magnitude of the subject ought to be the freedom of debate. It is only in this way that we can hope to arrive at truth and fulfill the great responsibility which we hold to God and our country. Should I keep back my opinions at such a time, through fear of giving offense, I should consider myself as guilty of treason towards my country and of an act of disloyalty to the majesty of heaven, which I revere above all earthly things." Just recently here in Williamsburg City, there was an event that took place in the Raleigh Tavern. It was a local merchant by the name of Hardcastle, poor deluded soul, obviously cannot shed his loyalty to the king. He first imbibed a great deal more rum than he should have, and then in a very loud voice began making proclamations, making his observations upon the abilities of the Virginia militia. He pointed out that after watching them in drill, that he believed that they were probably going to shoot themselves when they finally were engaged in battle with the British Army, that they didn't know which end of a musket the ball came out of. He suggested that when they did meet British regulars in the field, they would be mowed down as though they were ripe wheat on a cool summer's day, and he longed further that he could be there to observe it. He referred to them as Henry's toy soldiers and other disparaging, demoralizing comments. Shortly thereafter, the local committee of safety of Williamsburg City approached Mr. Hardcastle. They took him forcibly to the street in front of a great number of people. They had a mock trial, pronounced him guilty of treason, and marched him to the Liberty Pole, where he was threatened with a coat of thickset, hot tar, and wild goose feathers. They didn't go so far as that, but they did get what they desired, a public apology. Furthermore, his name has been printed in the Virginia Gazettes for all to read, in which he is deemed an enemy to America, an approver of American grievances, and it is recommended in the strongest of terms that none of his countrymen, you, have anything whatever to do with him ever again. In short, civil death. Hardcastle has resolved to leave the city of Williamsburg, and good riddance to him, say I. You ask my reaction as the governor of the Commonwealth on this behavior and the conduct of the Committee of Safety? I fully support and embrace what they did. My friends, I am now the government. It is my responsibility to keep you safe, and I will not tolerate such demoralizing talk of the men who are sworn to protect you. I see that I have expired my time, but before I take my leave, permit me to offer some friendly advices to you. Be very, very mindful of what you say with regard to the Virginia the military line, because there are people listening, and I warrant you, you might find yourself presented with a fine new suit of clothes, courtesy of your local Committee of Safety, one made of hot tar and wild goose feathers. I am your servant.
All right. I've done a number of speaking events, but I've never had to follow a founding father before. So that is a tough act to come up after. Just to remind you who I am, I did not found any countries. I did found a news site called Vox.com. And something that I had heard when I was a student journalist, something that I've heard becoming a journalist, and something that I'm sure you all have heard about, is that there is a category of free speech threats to journalists that you hear a lot about. Police intimidation, government censorship, corporate lawsuits, things like that. And those are real threats. Terrorism, of course, is one that we've been hearing a lot about lately. But there's another category of free speech threats that I want to talk to you about that you hear almost nothing about in the US today, even though it is a tremendous curb on free speech that affects journalism and affects the kind of media that you can read as a reader every single day. And that is the culture of overwhelming and systemic online harassment of women journalists and journalists of color. And that's one reason that you don't hear much about it, is because of the people who it affects. So to kind of give you a sense for what I'm talking about, it helps to tell you about how I came to glimpse this a little bit firsthand. Back during the Charlie Hebdo coverage, in the days after the shooting, there were debates in a lot of newsrooms, including ours, about whether or not to post the controversial covers and cartoons that Charlie Hebdo had run. We decided to run them. We thought they had enough news value. The New York Times and a lot of other publications said, no, we're not going to run them. They're very denigrating to Muslims and to Islam, and for reasons of taste, we just don't want to put it on our pages. And now that was fine. But this became a huge media controversy, and it was framed as a decision not of taste, but of defending or caving rights to free speech. And the implication was that the real reason that the New York Times, for example, decided not to publish this was because they feared the threat from radical Islamism, and that they had, surrendered American free speech in order to preserve their physical safety against this threat. And there was a really weird moment when MSNBC ran a segment about our decision to publish them, calling us the bravest publication in America for printing them, which I thought was pretty weird. A, because lots of people had run them, not just us, and B, because this idea of some kind of risk to us, some kind of physical threat, had never entered into our decision-making or our thinking whatsoever. So they were building us up as, defying the terrorists and taking this brave stand, when in fact we had done no such thing. And that was just how severe was this sense among people that, oh my God, the terrorists are trying to take our free speech away, and it could collapse at any moment. I cover the Middle East, I cover Israel-Palestine, I cover a lot of issues that get me a lot of hate mail. It's just kind of part of my life, part of my daily job. I work on the internet, which means that if I run an article about how I ate a sandwich for lunch, I will get hate mail about that sandwich. But we didn't get a peep for running these cartoons. Nobody cared. We didn't get a single, not a tweet, not an email, not a Facebook post. Nobody seemed to mind, despite the fact that there was this hysteria out there that all you had to do was look at these cartoons and you were at mortal peril. And the reason that I mention this is that there was another story we were covering at the same time that was also part of Charlie Hebdo. And this was the wave of attacks in France, reprisal attacks against French Muslims. France is a very large Muslim community. A lot of people in France were very angry after the attacks. They blamed all Muslims, and there were a number of shootings at French mosques. There were a few French Muslim kids who got pulled off the streets and beaten. We wrote about that. There were also some people in the US, talking heads like Bill Maher and Bill O'Reilly, who went on TV and said, hey, this just goes to show that all Muslims are evil and that Islam is inherently violent and that we're at war with Islam and all this terrible stuff. And we wrote some articles saying, no, that's not right. Muslims are people just like us. And what was interesting was that it was actually covering this story that brought on not just hundreds of pieces of hate mail, but dozens of really vicious death threats. And I don't mean just emails like, hey, I didn't like that article and I think you should take it down, but really specific, I'm going to come to your house at this time and this is what I'm going to do to kill you for writing this article. So it was striking to me that the thing that was supposed to have engendered all of this anger, the thing that we were so sensitive about, the threat from terrorism, had in fact seemed to upset nobody. And this thing that we had not heard about, this risk of if you write defending Islam, people will be very angry at you and threaten to kill you, is not something that people were talking about. And this for me was basically a blip in my life, right? It was 1 week that was really unpleasant on the internet. I shut down my email and then I was fine and my life went back to normal. I never really feared for my safety. But I have a female colleague, Amanda Taub, who had written the same stories. And she had not just received the same death threats, but something that is very common for female journalists who write for a national audience on the internet, which is she had received a series of very explicit rape threats. And so the reason that I'm mentioning all this was because this was the moment when I realized this was very unusual for me, but for her, for my female colleagues, this is just daily life on the internet. Every story that she writes that has anything to do with identity politics, gender, with race, she knows for a fact she is going to be inundated with death threats, with rape threats. I have a black colleague who, whenever she covers criminal justice, gets emails like, Michael Brown had it coming and you will too. This is just a fact of life if you were a female journalist or a journalist of color writing on the internet for a national audience about identity politics. And it's something that people kind of know in the media is happening, but it's not something that you guys will probably hear much about and that gets a lot of discussion. And I think that's because of the people who it's targeting. I mean, part of what's going on here is that forever and ever, media institutions have been dominated by people who look like me, right? White guys. And so female journalists, journalists of color, have not really had a voice. The advent of the web, for the last few years, all of a sudden they're getting a voice. They don't have to try to get a job being a New York Times columnist. They can start their own blog. They can go directly serve these audiences that the traditional media has been underserving. And there are a lot of people online, this vast community, that really hates that. And if you guys have heard about Gamergate, that's what this is all about. It's all about people reacting against the inclusion and rising prominence of female voices in journalism on national subjects and voices of color in national subjects, and really hating this and responding to it with a campaign of systemic, targeted online harassment, which often includes threats but is not exclusive to threats. And it's meant to shut these conversations down. And I have to tell you, as brave as my colleagues are, they are human and they have limits. And this is actively curbing free speech. Danielle Citron, who's a law professor at the University of Maryland, wrote a paper in 2009 in the Boston University Law Review. I wanted to make sure I got the quote right. She wrote that online harassment of women has grown so systemic and severe that it constitutes discrimination in women's employment opportunities by discouraging women from writing and earning a living online. So this is more than just angry emails. As Citron wrote, it interferes with their professional lives. It raises their vulnerability to offline sexual violence. It brands them as incompetent workers and inferior sexual objects. The harassment causes considerable emotional distress. So if you are a female journalist or a journalist of color, you have to make this decision every day when you come into work, when you open up your computer. Are you going to endure that harassment, those threats? Are you going to let your family be subjected to those threats in order to do your job? And, people have limits. At some point they say enough, or at some point they say this is too distressing and I can't deal with it. And even if they do push on, they're now paying a price just for who they are and the type of things that they're writing about. So there's not an easy solution to this, but it is something that you hear very little about. So I think the first thing that we can do as a society to try to confront this threat, because it is something that is so widespread and systemic, rather than coming from 3 or 4 terrorists who we can point to, is for people to just be aware of the fact that this is happening and just be aware that there are these vast online communities that are proliferating this harassment, and that this really does affect free speech in America today to an extent that I think many people would find surprising. Thanks.
We are under fire not only from external threats and online intimidation of freedom of expression, but internally as well. There are so many areas of American life that, while I wouldn't say that we're operating on a high horse, that we have to continuously struggle to maintain and protect the right for folks to speak freely. Look into some universities where students are afraid to complain about teachers that don't act appropriately, who take a political or ideological stance and don't encourage a full and fair discussion of the other points of view, or they judge much too easily those who agree with them and much too harshly those who disagree. The idea that speakers are invited to address a university audience and then they are canceled because of the sentiments of some that those views are unpopular. That's the kind of thing that we have to stand up against. Look at the workplace. We have every day in this country, employees are afraid to speak up against misconduct against them. They are afraid that if they speak up and they go to HR, that they will be the one who ends up being hurt, that the word will get out among the employees. So every day employees have to weigh, do they want to take the risk of losing friendships, of damaging their career? Women afraid to stand up and be strong in the workplace because they're afraid that they're going to be considered a bitch and that they are not treated the same as others in the workplace. At least in universities, we do, and we did it back when I was at William & Mary, independent course evaluations. So you could anonymously evaluate the instructors. We have situations in government where employees are afraid to speak out against wrongdoing in government agencies. They are afraid to disagree with the policies of their agencies. That's one of the reasons there are whistleblower statutes, to try to encourage people to feel that the harm from them speaking truth to power will be outweighed by some protections. The idea that when folks speak to the press, giving them protection and protecting their rights so that they will come forward and report that which needs to be reported. Even politically, look at what happens on Capitol Hill. It's unbelievable how when a particular party is in power, they do certain things and the members of their party defend that conduct, which if they were out of power, they would be strongly criticizing, because they're afraid of the consequences of speaking out are much too great. And they are. In the law, we give protection to witnesses who are afraid that if they testify against organized crime or they testify against gangs or whatever, that they're going to be protected. And there are measures that recognize that you have to create incentives to allow people to testify so we can basically bring truth to power. How much do we value freedom of expression? There are so many things in life that we talk about, and we talk about them over and over. In my work in cybersecurity, the expression, "I've been in this meeting before," or "I've heard that speech before." In fact, I just recently heard a very powerful American gave a speech. I said, "I testified before Congress. I gave that same speech," with the one exception where the sentence that said, "The Sony hack will be the watershed moment," which of course is not true. The Sony hack will not be the watershed moment. What do we do when we're serious about protecting somebody? Yes, we talk, but we try to act strategically. We try to understand what we need to worry about and what we need to do about it. We need to marshal the resources and the stakeholders of a particular area and the experts. And we need to think strategically, and we need to come up with goals, objectives, and milestones so we can measure success and, frankly, we can measure failure. We don't want folks in government to have their proposals that there be a strategic plan for cybersecurity for America rejected because a government official says, "But if we do that, it'll be too easy to tell if we fail." That's precisely the point. Let's talk a little bit about national security compared to freedom of expression, and it's not a perfect analogy. The Cold War, protecting against the threat posed by the Soviet Union. So there were two major things that we did. We strengthened our defenses, strengthened our nuclear capability, our non-nuclear capability, our military forces, our technology, our planes, our radar. President Reagan proposed a Star Wars initiative at one point. We had to have credibility. We had to have the strength that our adversaries would know that when we said we would do something, we would and could do it. We developed and strengthened a deterrent strategy. Unfortunately, in this world, deterrence is kind of a soft thing. We saw what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis when the Soviet Union pulled the missiles out of Cuba. They were convinced that the United States meant it, that the deterrent strategy we employed, that if you do this, we will do that, and we have the capability to do that, would happen. You look at the Ukraine. You look at what President Putin said recently about Crimea. He said he was surprised there wasn't a reaction when he went in. And that balancing about having credibility and making sure you use force when it makes sense. So how's national security different than than cybersecurity? Unfortunately, there are very important differences. We have to strengthen our cyber defenses. But cyber defense is in some ways problematic. It's more problematic even than national security. We are dependent on national security. We are dependent on cybersecurity for our national security, our law enforcement and public safety, our economic well-being, and the privacy of our data. But we are incredibly vulnerable as a nation to cyber attacks. So we need to do something about those defenses. We need to try to help make government and private companies more capable and trying to hold folks accountable to do what's necessary to protect that which we really care about. And so part of the challenge, when you look at something like the Sony breach, when, as the US government says, the North Koreans hacked into the Sony system, that the information about individual employees and the emails and the social security numbers and all that, or the trade secrets for particular companies. We have extra measures we can do to protect that which is most important. But in cybersecurity, everything's vulnerable and there are too many targets. Now, deterrence is another problem in cybersecurity. It's problematic. Attribution is one of the big problems. You saw the situation where in North Korea, the US government came out and said, well, it was the North Koreans who hacked into Sony systems. Some private security firms came out and said, no, it was not the US government, which I thought, I mean, that's certainly speaking freedom of expression. And in that case, the US government came out surprisingly and said, and nobody really contradicted them, that they own, in effect, the North Korean system. So they know firsthand whether or not it was North Korea, and they know it was North Korea behind that. Unfortunately, most of cyberspace, we don't know that. And the importance that we saw in the Cold War of communicating an effective deterrence message, if you don't know who did it, and even if you do know who did it, what are the measures that can be done in response? There is no internationally accepted protocol for what you do, certainly not strike back, where you would attack back. And frankly, so many systems are interrelated that one of the problems is if you attack back against particular servers, for example, it may have a cascading effect on other people. We saw recently that President Obama announced some measures to try to impose economic sanctions on people and organizations that might be behind cyber attacks. More targeted in a way than what was done, the economic sanctions imposed against some in the North Korean government in response to the attacks against Sony. Those were not particularly targeted to the cybersecurity. They were not particularly targeted to the people who did it. But that problem of an effective deterrence of who you're going to go back against and what you're going to do makes it very, very difficult. We have to reduce the cyber attacks and the vulnerabilities of all kinds against government systems, against our critical infrastructure, against our economic the trade secrets of our companies, and against freedom of expression. It has to be a strategic effort involving government and the private sector. So some of the things we have to do is we have to pursue international agreement. And it's not just government to government like the US and Iran. It's private companies, non-governmental organizations, government entities, because cyberspace is a shared ownership, a shared responsibility. And we have to work together to come up with standards, best practices, and norms of conduct, including internet service providers. And you see, for example, one of the major problems we have in attacks in cyberspace are botnets. Those are the networks of hijacked computers that are used to launch and relay attacks that make it harder to go back and find out who was behind it, that spread the malicious software that gets implanted on our computers around the world. Well, one of the ways to address that is the internet service providers can see the computers that are bots, that are owned. And so an agreement was reached a few years ago among the 5 largest ISPs in the United States that they were going to implement an anti-botnet strategy. But that's the kind of thing, going against botnets in the world is one of the major challenges in cyberspace that we're really not doing enough about, and we're not holding folks accountable. So I think the bottom line for me is that, like so many things, that if we're serious about something, we have to act, and we have to act smartly. And in cyberspace, we have to make sure we bring together government and private companies and come up with agreement and share information. But we can't just keep having a speech over and over again. Oh, we have to share information, and we need trust to share information. And then suddenly 10 years have gone by, and you're still saying the same thing. You have to think strategically. What's the information we need to share, and with whom, and how do we have to share it, and how do we have to track to make sure that's happened? Because if we don't have the ability to measure success, we don't have the ability to measure failure, and we can't be serious about addressing the risks we face in cyberspace generally, or the risks of cyber intimidation of freedom of expression.
Hi, I'm Drew Dernovich. I'm the cartoonist of the group, so I feel like I should be the wild card of the bunch. So I'll try and make it a little lighthearted. This is one of my cartoons, and it doesn't have anything to do with the panel. I just want to show you what my work looks like. I took a fondness for printmaking over there at Andrews Hall, actually, and so my cartoons look like woodcuts intentionally. I'm kind of known as the woodcut guy at The New Yorker. So that's me. This is not me. This is a cartoon by a guy named Bert Kleiben. He was a cartoonist in the 1970s. He was kind of the Far Side, the Gary Larson of the 1970s. He's a cartoonist that's revered by cartoonists. And he's before my time a little bit, but this was why I became a cartoonist in the first place. As you can see, the policeman is saying, "Out of the way, you swine, a cartoonist is coming." And that's because I thought that to be a cartoonist was to be like a cultural rock star. We said things, we got to say what we want, we're a little bit dangerous. We apparently got really bulbous, cartoony-looking women walking us down the street. So cartoonists were badasses, or so I thought. Maybe we weren't. But as I stand here today, cartoonists don't really have the same kind of cultural cachet that either they did or that I thought we did. It's different in Europe, but in America we've had, in the 1990s, as the media landscape started shrinking, print publications started shrinking, a lot of the editorial cartoon positions started going away, and now there are editorial cartoonists, but they're largely legacy jobs. Newspapers aren't really hiring staff editorial cartoonists anymore. We still have The New Yorker, in terms of other print publications, they still do gag cartoons, and they're one of the few that does, but even the magazines that used to publish cartoons don't really anymore. And as my colleague Matt Bors pointed out in January, there were more cartoonists killed in the Paris massacre than are employed by all new media websites in America combined, which are places like Vox, no offense, like Daily Beast and the Huffington Post, Politico. In that way, cartoons have followed the same path as long-form journalism. They're things that everyone likes and they say that they want and that they're vital, but that's not where the money has gone. It's not where the priorities have gone. So that's what the environment is like in America. And like I said, it's followed a different path in Europe. But we do have The New Yorker, which I'm thankful for. And the way that we treat politics at The New Yorker in the cartoons is kind of in a sideways or oblique fashion. The cartoon editor, his name is Bob Mankoff, and I don't know if you know the concept in comedy of punching down. You're not supposed to take aim at a target that's less than yourself. You're not supposed to make fun of poor people or misfortunate people. That's called punching down. At The New Yorker, we claim that we don't punch down or punch up. We kind of elbow sideways. We're making observations about current events that are funny, but they're not aimed to really provoke. And this cartoon is by Alex Gregory. This was submitted shortly after 9/11, and this was rejected by the magazine. You can see there's a tailor looking at the man who's being fitted for a suicide vest, and he's saying, "Too snug." And compared to the things that you see online now, this cartoon seems kind of quaint or cute even. It seems kind of tame. But Bob likes to say that the way we deal with politics at The New Yorker is to create a safe space. We talk about current events, but we create a safe space where we can deal with them in a kind of absurd way, and this cartoon still is a little bit too real and too raw. It still makes you think about the reality of suicide bombing, so you can't really laugh at it. And other publications do that better and more frequently than The New Yorker does. Here's an example of how we do treat politics. This is one of my cartoons. It's not really one of my best. I'm not really fond of the drawing or the joke, but you can see this. One gang member is saying, "There's more to being a Crip than being just anti-blood," right? So the joke works on its own, in that it's about gang politics, but the reason that I did it was, in 2009, the story that was dominating the news was that Republicans were blocking Obama's agenda. He was a new president, and he had to get in his legislation. And so I was trying to think of a metaphor for the story that was, or the news item that was, is there anything more to being a Republican than just being anti-Obama? So this was a metaphor for that. And because it's The New Yorker, we like to think our readers are intelligent, they can put two and two together, and that when you read this cartoon, you can look at it and understand it on its face, or that if you think about it, you can understand that it was put in the magazine as a metaphor for what's going on politically, and we like to think that our readers are that smart and that they can understand that. And that in that way, the cartoon is timeless, because you can easily envision a scenario in which maybe 2 years from now, Jeb is president and there's a Democratic Congress, and this cartoon becomes relevant for the opposite reason. So it's either timeless or it's equally lame. I'm not sure. And here's another cartoon of mine done from, you can tell when it was done, in September of 2008. Am I a white man in a red state voting for a black president, or am I a blue man in a white state voting for a green president? So it's just, insofar as it's about the confusion of identity politics, it's also timeless or timelessly lame, depending on how you like your humor. But my chief concern, really, personally, in terms of the free speech threat, is not necessarily in print, but in this performance that I do. So another cartoonist at The New Yorker, his name is Matt Diffie, and we created this show, this improv show called Fisticuffs. And it's like any other improv show. We get a bunch of cartoonists on stage, we divide them into teams, and it's like regular improv except involving drawing. So we have these ways of getting topics, random topics from the audience. We do stupid things like have a wheel and we fill out topics, we spin it a couple times, and whatever topics come up, these teams of cartoonists have to draw a cartoon about. So this, I think, is schnitzel and rain, fear of something. Usually they're a lot more, usually they're a lot crazier. It seems like every time we do it, we've done this show we did it monthly in New York at a nightclub for a while. We've done it for comedy festivals and media festivals. It seems like every show, the audience always wants to draw priests having sex with nuns in hell or in it's always ridiculous. I'm drawing things that are personally offensive to me, and I'm not really a person that likes to shock people, but in this format, you kind of you need to get laughs from the audience, so you have to intentionally shock. But the safety part of it for me is you draw something that is kind of shocking and crazy and offensive, you put it up on a screen, and it's up there for 3 seconds, and the audience laughs, and 3 seconds later it gets taken down, and then it disappears forever. Except that's not the way that it works now with the internet, because half these things are streaming online, as this is. People have their phones and ways to take pictures. And something that I did in a moment of, crazy, just wanting to get laughs, not thinking, and put up on a screen, meaning to disappear after 3 seconds, someone takes a picture of it and puts it online. And when you're looking at something on a computer screen that's removed from its original context, it takes on all kinds of meanings and intents and messages which I never intended in the first place. And that's terrifying to me because you get a bunch of people who, we did this show in Germany last year with 12 cartoonists, and it was crazy. And it is streaming online, and I drew things that I'm glad that my family and friends would never see. But the Parisian cartoonists definitely had intent. They were throwing bombs, and they were definitely trying to ruffle feathers. You get a bunch of cartoonists who maybe have a different purpose. We're just trying to have fun and do something crazy. But when you remove it from its initial context, the internet provides a tremendous platform for the multiplication of offense, of people becoming offended. And that's not a good development. And that's I think, a reason why the freedom of speech protections need to be enforced and safeguarded in any way that they can. I actually have a cartoon coming up in the not this week, but maybe in the next few issues of The New Yorker, where I had to self-censor myself because of the very thing that you talked about. And maybe you can ask me that during the panel. But I'll stop now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, all of you. And we've now come to the second part of our program, where we're going to have a bit of a panel discussion reacting to some of the comments that you heard in the first part of our session. And then we're going to open things up for questions from the audience. One of the things, Max, you raised an issue that Andy alluded to as well, is cyber intimidation. And we're seeing more of this. I'm wondering how much, there's always been sort of a raucous dialogue in public life, but it seems to have gotten so much worse. And your examples sort of reveal that. Is part of this the transition to the internet, is sort of this anonymous vehicle where people can be more and more outrageous and vile and threatening than in an earlier age?
I think that's a lot of it. And I mean, these are like, to be clear, the thing I'm talking about is not, oh, someone was mean to me on the internet. These are things that if you walked up to someone and said them in person, it would clearly be against the law.
It's criminal, yes.
Right, yeah, exactly. But because you can do it online and anonymously, the legal protections are weak, which police agency do you refer to? There are a lot of complicated reasons that it becomes incredibly difficult to enforce. And I think one of the most salient is just that it is so easy and so frictionless for people to go online and anonymously threaten, that so many people do it, that even if you could invent a magical agency that would go out and enforce restricting all of these free speech threats, there are thousands. And part of it is it's a reaction to change and very sudden cultural changes that people are feeling. And in past times, I'm a big fan of Mad Men. I enjoy the show. And it's similar in that there are cultural changes in that show, and people react to that very violently. But a lot of it is just the mechanisms of the web make it so easy for people to make these threats and so difficult to enforce them. And it's because of it's very easy, if I wanted to go online and levy one threat, that's very easy for me to do. But the effect of the people receiving them is not to receive one, it's to receive thousands. So you get this kind of mob effect that has a much more chilling effect on free speech than a single threat would. And that makes it incredibly difficult to enforce and combat.
So let me throw this open to the others. Andy, perhaps you. Is this just an inevitable feature of modern life that we're going to have to put up with this type of cyber intimidation, and there's really nothing we can do?
Well, I think it's certainly going to be something that happens for quite a while. The internet creates additional tools for folks who want to make a public statement in a way that can be anonymous, or it can be a group like Anonymous. Reminds me of the Monkees when they said it's not a real group. It's like Anonymous isn't a real group, but they can do things like deface a website. So in 2011, the CIA website was defaced. CENTCOM, the military command, was defaced. The Iranians attacked a number of banks. So the ability to do things in a publicly visible way, it's like rather than just writing on the wall some graffiti, you can do something in the internet that gets visibility and that gets publicity. Over time, we're going to be able to do more things about them. Something like a website or public defacing, although it's very embarrassing for the CIA to have their website defaced, it's really not that big a deal. And if it was something critical, like an internet company that needs the ability to have their payment system operating, they would take additional precautions at greater expense to protect it. It's really a risk management strategy and doing some of the additional things I talked about during my opening remarks that's going to help reduce the effect of this over time, but it's going to be with us pretty much forever, I think.
I might point out that there's nothing new about anonymous attacks. For those gentlemen who subscribe to the Virginia Gazette, for example, oftentimes they will see a letter that is attacking personally some other gentleman, but it's signed with a pseudonym. It might be Tacitus or Cato or a Virginian. So there's nothing new in the anonymous side of personal attacks.
Well said. Indeed, it's been with us. They've gotten, perhaps, would you say, living in our century now as well, that the attacks have become more vicious and vile than in your time?
I would say that we do have a great deal more gentility in the 18th century, so yes.
Now, Drew, let me ask you this. One of the great elements of political discourse in this country, really dating back to the 19th century, is the political cartoon. And there have been so many marvelous images that really capture some of the reality of our political debate, and you've spoken about this. Why is this tradition, why are we losing this? Is it all about economics of newspapers?
I think there are multiple reasons, and I think that might be the biggest one. Like I said, as newspapers started to constrict and shed these jobs, the position of staff cartoonists, editorial cartoonists went by the wayside. And as I mentioned in the article, that meant that the cartoonists that people held onto were going to they needed to appeal to the broadest amount of people as possible, because they needed to sell papers. So cartoonists were encouraged to not take real radical ideological stances against anything, and kind of adopt the late night monologue style joke, which now dominates editorial cartooning. And I think that's as much as anything, affects why cartoonists are kind of safer in America than they are in Europe. In Europe, it's like still the frontier out there in terms of cartooning. If you go to a bookstore, a magazine rack, you can see cartoons that are just, that would never make it to the shelves here. And I think that's probably why.
Now, Max, does Vox engage in political cartoons? I know, of course, you published the Charlie Hebdo cartoons.
Yeah, we published those. No, we don't. We have a small staff of about 40 people. We haven't had the resources to hire political cartoonists. But something that I think it's ironic to what you were talking about, Drew, is that more people are actually consuming political cartoons in huge numbers. But they're doing it by, someone will go to like Matt Bohr's, they'll take his cartoons and then they'll put it on like Reddit or Imgur or some like free image sharing website. And then thousands or hundreds of thousands of people will look at it in a way that gets him no revenue. So it's much easier to spread the cartoons out and for many people to see them. But because of the online model, it's just too easy to copy paste, save as, and then how do you charge for it?
Yes, yes. Drew, I also wanted to come back to you too. You talked about maybe sometimes there needs to be some restraint, self-restraint, or gee, I don't think I'm going to use this cartoon. And I wonder if you'd reflect on both the decision not to run the cartoon that you showed us and the pressure on cartoonists to show greater restraint.
Sure. I think that, there are two, when I heard about the shooting, the Charlie Hebdo shooting, I thought of two things. One was that no one should ever be killed for drawing a cartoon in the first place. Second of all, as an artist or as a cartoonist, a designer even, there's two ways that you can approach it when you're dealing with a threat or a limitation on your work. In this case, you're never going to draw the Prophet Muhammad, or any other limitation that's imposed by an editor or by a bully or by a regime. And that's one of them is you can say, forget it, I'm going to assert my rights, I'm going to do what they're telling me not to do anyway. Or you can, I think good art is born out by saying, I'm going to accept this limitation and I'm going to say what I want to say and do what I want to do, playing by your rules and using your terms. One example it has nothing to do with cartoons, but I used to support myself when I lived in Boston by drawing portraits on gravestones. That's what I did for 10 years. I did people's portraits on gravestones. You can let that sink in a little bit. It's the completely opposite of cartooning. But because the art program here was good and I was capable of doing realistic portraits on stones, that's what we did. And there was a Catholic cemetery that wouldn't allow people's actual portraits. They would allow, you could draw the Virgin Mary, you could draw flowers, you could draw the Pietà, you could draw anything, but you couldn't draw the actual face of the deceased. So we would do, this wasn't my idea, I didn't come up with this, but we would draw angels, but you'd notice that the angel would have glasses and would have maybe would be balding, a little bit of curly hair, maybe a double chin. And then he would say, oh, the angel is actually the portrait of the person who's laying in the ground here. And it was a way to circumvent the rule because we were obviously doing a portrait, but the church couldn't say that this is a portrait because they couldn't say what an angel looks like. So it was a way to say, you're going to give us this limit, we're going to do what we want because this is what the people want. We're going to play by your rules. And the church couldn't come back and say, this is what an angel looks like or doesn't look like. So they kind of had to admit that, whoever came up with that idea won that battle. And they still might have lost their lives because, like I said, they were shooting missiles at Islam in general. But I love the idea of saying, all right, we'll take this limit and we're gonna ridicule you on your own terms because what we have to say is tyranny is the least creative thing that you can. It's the least creative way to express yourself. And I think that good art, good creativity will always win out.
Max, I'm curious, you spoke about the intense reaction that Vox received to some of his stories about Islam in the wake of Charlie Hebdo and perhaps before. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the other areas that just provoke particularly intense, vile, threatening responses from your readers, and then how do you respond as a publisher to that?
I think people on the internet can and do get upset about everything, but the kinds of stories that, in our experience, elicit the most vicious response are things that challenge the status quo or that challenge the groups that dominate the status quo. So in our coverage of what happened in Ferguson, anything that touched on larger issues in racism and criminal justice in America would draw a furious response. And I think part of it was that, in that example, people kind of have a sense that that's true, and they have a sense that that's out there, but there are a lot of people who find the implications of dealing with that to be very threatening. And they find the implications of a feminist writer writing about differences in pay for men and women, very threatening. And again, like Gamergate, I think is a great example of this, where you have a certain community, in the case of Gamergate, it's white men who are involved in video gaming and like reading and writing about video gaming online. They feel like they are the privileged community, and as people are coming in and saying, well, wait, you know, women don't have a voice in here, you need to include women, that to them isn't heard as, well, this is great, we'll also include women and they'll have a voice. It's heard as a threat. It's experienced as a threat. And this is something that you see throughout American history, right? See, like how I brought it around there? Where you have certain entrenched power groups, and then gradually you move towards equality, but the group that is losing power is really upset about it, and they fight back to hang on to that. And I think that that is something that plays out in a lot of places in American life. Obviously, journalism is just one slice of that, but it's certainly the part that we experience.
Let me follow up with that by asking about one particular feature of contemporary online journalism, and it's the emergence of comments and the ability of everyone to participate in the dialogue through anonymous comment. Good development? Bad development?
No. We have no comments on our website. I have never understood why people have comments on their website.
The quality does seem to be rather poor.
It does seem to be rather poor. I agree with you. I mean, there are some people, like Ta-Nehisi Coates is a writer at The Atlantic, who works very hard at curating a community, and they have discussions, and it's very edifying, and it's really enriching for the people who are involved. But for most of them, the people who feel compelled to jump in for whatever reason are not always, but are often the people who have kind of the craziest or the angriest views. So we decided to close our comment section. We said, you know, you've got a whole wide world of social media out there where you can share your views, and you should go do that. But the bottom of our articles is not the right place to post your racist screed.
Andy, let me come back to you. You've been very focused for some years on cybersecurity and its effect on free speech. If you were summoned tomorrow to the halls of power to offer your recommendations for what should this nation do in response to cybersecurity threats, and what are your recommendations? The president calls you in and says, Andy, what do we do? You've been working this problem.
Let me respond and then perhaps add a comment or two to what Max said and some others. I think we're starting to see some constructive actions in this country. There are a number of actions following President Obama's order on cybersecurity that came out a couple years ago. And some of those measures are pretty encouraging. We don't have enough accountability in this country for cybersecurity. We don't have a strategy. We don't have goals, objectives, and milestones for what we're trying to accomplish. We haven't since I ran the cyber effort, and we still don't. And I think that's a problem. I think congressional oversight is kind of an oxymoron when it comes to cybersecurity. I think there's a tendency to just say the same thing over and over and over again. And so some of the efforts that are really good right now, and the Federal Communications Commission just came out with some very important efforts for our telecom sector, but the idea of having the private sector be a major player in trying to identify how do we evaluate risk for that we care about most, which is particularly our critical infrastructure. Getting the capability for companies tailored to their particular needs to identify and understand to what extent are they ready to predict, detect, respond, and recover from cybersecurity, and to what extent are they analyzing where their products come from, the whole supply chain. We've been talking for years about supply chain risk in cyberspace, and we're doing nothing about it. This July, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, is going to have a workshop on supply chain. It's very important to my company, and it's got to be important to everybody. And so I see some encouraging things moving in that direction, but we need the press to be more critical, we need the Congress to be more critical, and we need to have the ability to judge success and to judge failure.
What we'd like to do now is open the panel open to the audience. And so we have a couple of microphones that are set up. If you have a question for the audience, please step. I believe there's a microphone right here, and we'd like to bring you into this dialogue. So yeah, there we go. We have a brave soul moving towards the microphone.
Thanks, you guys. So this has been really awesome. And Andy, this question is for you, and I was interested, you talked a little bit about whistleblower statutes and cybersecurity, which brings up the concept sort of data security and data protection in general. And obviously, for many of us, that brings up the concept of sort of Snowden, right, and the revelations that came out several years ago. And I was wondering whether or not sort of, you know, there have been a number of threats or a number of lawsuits that have come out since the Snowden revelations of people sort of challenging whether or not under the Fourth Amendment, right, the people's right to be secure from unreasonable searches and seizures, whether or not you know, we can actually sort of sue the NSA, and we've sort of learned that telecoms have been complicit. And I'm sort of wondering, you know, a lot of this program has talked about sort of the chill on speech that comes as a result of terrorist attacks, so the Charlie Hebdo attacks and things like that. But it seems these suits have been brought by journalists who are alleging that their own free speech is being chilled by the activities of the government, who could potentially be eavesdropping or surveilling on conversations that they're having with international targets and things like that. So it seems to me that we've sort of created this feedback loop, or that journalists feel that we've created a positive feedback loop, wherein in trying to actually combat terror, we're actually chilling speech in that way too. And without the American people sort of knowing the magnitude of the threat or the magnitude of the surveillance, just sort of because of secrecy, it's sort of hard to do. So I was just wondering if you could sort of address that and your feelings on that, and whether or not we are sort of creating this feedback loop where in actually trying to combat terror, we're actually chilling speech potentially in that way as well. So thank you.
Well, that's a good question, but I'm sorry we're out of time, and thank you all for coming. There was an awful lot in your question, and I'll attempt to at least answer part of it, and then we will be out of time when you follow up. And that's one of the things I think, frankly, is missing in journalism today, is enough follow-up. And you look on the Sunday morning programs where they're not asking the tough questions, and even if they do, they never ask the follow-up. You're like, well, ask them the follow-up. And I think they do that because they want to make sure the top guests are going to come on the show again. And that may be wrong, but that's my perception of it, and I think we're losing as a result. There are a number of activities going on in the world to respond to some of those revelations. You know, some of them affected my company as well, although we didn't voluntarily participate. So the European government, the European Union, is in some serious discussions with the United States government about the Europeans, as you know, were very upset about what they believe happened or didn't happen in terms of some of these things. And what they are trying to come up with is a clearer definition of an exemption for homeland security or national security that I think they believe the Americans have much too broad a definition. So you can do everything you want. I think the Europeans would like to have a set of rules that folks will follow that have transparency and accountability. And certainly some of that would have to be more confidential. And certainly I think the idea of trying to come up with some norms of conduct that folks agree to, and then we can track the extent to which folks actually follow it, I think would be very helpful, because you know the need to protect our security, but the importance of protecting privacy, the importance of protecting freedom of expression is really critical. We didn't talk about one of the aspects of cyberspace is you want to be able to hold folks accountable, but particularly because of the reaction of some, anonymity can be a really good thing. And if somebody's totally anonymous, then they can do a whole bunch of bad things. So trying to have some kind of conditional anonymity so that then when people do things that the society believes are wrong or criminal or whatever, that some action can be taken against them, but generally in terms of a broad definition of what free expression is, allowing that kind of conduct, but not allowing the government to intercede and get access to the information or basically intimidate the people that are trying to express it. So I'm sure I didn't fully answer your question, but that's my attempt.
Others on the panel?
Yeah, I would just add, I think something that has bothered me a little bit about the NSA Edward Snowden debate is that it often gets put into this black or white binary of either everything the NSA does is essential for national security and we have to preserve their rights because that's how we stay safe, or that the NSA is an evil agency that is out to destroy our freedom and must be brought down. And I think when you start to deal with big bureaucratic institutions, and you have much more experience with this than I do, oftentimes the explanations are a lot less emotionally satisfying, but it'll just be institutional drift. It'll be maybe there's not enough safeguards. This manager isn't talking to the right person over here. And when you look at some of the things, or when I look at some of the things that were happening with the NSA, a lot of it gets down to this kind of nitty-gritty, unsexy stuff like, the FISA court system could really stand to be reformed such that there is a better set of internal safeguards that is more rigorous, but without compromising the NSA's ability to operate in secret. I mean, things like that they don't feel exciting because we want to have like a good guy and a bad guy, but sometimes the ways to fix it are just much more like boring institutional reform. And as a journalist, I try to get people excited about boring institutional reform, but it's really hard to get people to care about that stuff. But I mean, it is like the more you dig into the story, the more you start to see that there are a lot of shades of gray and a lot of really positive intentions that got turned in the wrong direction.
I think we're seeing a problem. This relates to, I think, something you said earlier. I think with a 24-hour news cycle, even though we have additional websites for expressing opinion and sharing news, I think there's an awful lot of repeating of what went on before. There are not enough instances where there's real analysis. You take a look in cybersecurity at how long the United States, and talking about being hesitant about saying certain things, I mean, there's certain things that, I'm not going to talk about. But you look at the kinds of things the U.S. government has talked about for 10, 12 years. And then you look at what actions the U.S. government has taken and when they took it. I mean, could somebody be a little more critical of the U.S. government about saying, well, wait a second, if you cared about it, that's all you've done after waiting all this time? I guess there's so many issues out there that it's hard for the media to keep track of it. But things like we saw regarding the Columbia Journalism review of the Rolling Stone article, I think we need more of that. I mean, the Washington Post dropped their ombudsman, somebody to kind of make sure you're doing it right. I don't think we're seeing enough of the critiquing. But in terms of your point about comment, I don't think we're seeing enough about point-counterpoint. And I realized some of the stuff years ago was kind of too much headline. But I'd like to see, and if we don't want to do a whole bunch of comments, that's fine, but have somebody who's an expert on climate change give an articulation of what's going on, what's happening, what's the evidence, and invite somebody else to use some of the kind of the dogma that some of the conservative use in response. And then have somebody respond. Some of these major issues, we need to have like an editorial page where an expert gives a comment and the next day somebody comments in some detail. The richness of our dialogue on public issues and social issues, I think, would be strengthened tremendously. And I just don't see enough of that.
Well, I think that's actually, if other people have questions, I don't want to bring us too much down into a discussion of the media, but one thing that the internet has done that's great is that the experts now have a platform. So like the absence of expert commentary on, let's say, the Iran nuclear deal, the voices that you hear are the National Iranian American Council, the Israel Project, Senator Tom Cotton, President Barack Obama, all people who have vested interests in seeing the Iran deal perceived a certain way. And the actual nuclear non-proliferation experts have much less of a voice in the kind of traditional media environment, right? You start with your lead about, wow, Tom Cotton said this crazy thing, and then Obama said a different thing, and that's it, the story's over. But now, like a guy I know, Jeffrey Lewis, who is a nuclear non-proliferation expert, he has a blog, and he has a Twitter account, and he can write 1,000 words where he goes through the nitty-gritty details of like the kind of centrifuges that Iran is going to be allowed to have, and it turns out there's a huge audience for this. So I think you're actually seeing a lot more direct expert commentary and experts speaking directly to readers. And I also think if you check out Vox, you will see that we have a lot of this good stuff too. You seem to not like the media you're consuming. I think you would like ours.
I'll try it.
So do others want to weigh in on this question, whether or not we've had sort of a deterioration of analysis as the news media has proliferated in so many different sites on the internet? It's an interesting dialogue between Andy and Max on this. Are we getting higher quality because now the internet's open for everyone to play, or are we getting weaker analysis because it's just he said this and the end of the story?
I think it's more of everything. You're getting a lot more low-quality stuff, because people love to seek out things that confirm their views. People love to seek out things that say, my opinions are all correct, and if people only shared my opinions, the people in power understood how right I was, everything would be great. People love that. It makes them feel really good. So there's a lot more of that. But I also like to think that we're finding ways to speak to and enlighten and inform and educate readers using the tools of the web, and finding ways to make things more accessible and more fun while also being kind of enlivening and interesting and educational.
Great. Another question back here?
Yes, thank you. Actually, I wouldn't mind hearing a response to his comment, if you have a second, as I know as you were listening to him, that you were kind of nodding, but I'm guessing you're not agreeing with what he's saying.
Well, there are an awful lot of sources that I either haven't taken the time or don't have the time to review. And so maybe I'm reading some of the more traditional kinds of media, and I think there are really some real shortcomings. I'm not happy about the readily accessible stuff about global warming. I'm not happy about the discussions that I didn't see surrounding the Selma March, and it's politically incorrect for a white guy to comment on some of the issues of the poor. And I think there's a tendency, because of political correctness, to not bring in the experts that need to be part of a discussion. The issues about the effect of tax cuts versus tax increases and the debate between the Democrats and Republicans. I think there's a lot more science that could go on there that I think is very important. But we need to have, I think, the media to play a greater role in shining the light of day and expertise on these things. And I think it's a shame it's not there.
Well, if I can make one comment about that and then ask a question. I guess my response to that would be that, and as I've taught political science courses over the years, and we talk about the media and how we should think about newspapers and news channels and whatnot, one of the things I've tried to tell students is that you need to realize these are businesses. I mean, these are entities that are out to make money. I mean, they employ people, they bring in advertising dollars and whatnot. It can be very small, it can be very large. So they have a lens. So when they look at a story, or at the beginning or early in the morning or late at night, there are editors there that make a decision. What are we going to cover today in this amount of time that we have? And so my assumption has been that news coverage nowadays is not really about, what does the New York Times say, everything fit to print. I mean, it's not literally, we're going to get every bit of information out unbiased to the public so that they know. It's not that. It's about what can we do to drive people to our site or to our radio program or to our TV show.
Well, I think there may be a difference between the opinion pages. I'd like to see the Post and the Times, for example, if they put a Paul Ryan or a Senator Schumer on,
Sure.
Invite somebody to be ready to give a response and then tell them the response is over here or the response is online. But I'd like to see more critique of the standard media. Look at the story about the attacks in Kenya. Look at the 2 front-page Washington Post articles that mention the word Christian once. I mean, is that decent coverage? Get Columbia journalism folks to analyze that. I mean, it's appalling. It's political correctness.
I agree completely, but my question is a little bit more fundamental. And I understand you guys are looking more at the cyber world. But what I have not heard from any of the 5 of you is, if we're going to try to foster freedom of speech, or we're going to protect it, or we're going to do something with it, because something needs to be done to it, I haven't heard a definition. So if we go back to the attacks in France, if I want to be critical, I could say, look, it's a trash newspaper. They trash every religion out there. They may do it equally, but it's still trash. It's crap. It's not opinion. They'll rip anything they can. Why should any of us care? Why should we admire it? Why anything? Now, I don't think they should be killed. But at the same time, why should I really care when these folks are saying, not in a debate, but they're just saying stupid stuff that doesn't get to the basis of that faith? Now, the other thing that I would say is that as a teacher, I have to think about freedom of speech a little bit differently. And so give me 1 second. My opinion of freedom of speech in the classroom, not here, but in general, K through 12 and higher ed, is that it's a lot less than it used to be. And I'll be self-critical. I think that faculty in general are terrible about fostering freedom of speech in the classroom, whether it's in discussion, whether it's what's assigned to read, whether it's what they will allow to be discussed in class, various viewpoints, whether it's what they will allow to be written about and how they then critique those students in their writing. So I'd like to get a response from you guys about, more fundamentally, How do you address what freedom of speech is or ought to be, and then somehow foster that and then protect that? Thank you.
Who wants to take that? I'll offer an initial thought just about the education piece is, I would say this, I'm not sure I agree with your generalization. Now, I teach in a law school. In law school, one of our central purposes is to foster debate, foster disagreement, be able to take positions that you don't actually agree with, because we're trying to create better critical thinking skills. And so I do want to offer that. I'm not sure I fully share that assumption. But I'd love to hear a take on the characterization of Charlie Hebdo. Why do we care? Obviously, we care about people dying, but is this an institution that is important to public discourse?
Well, so a colleague of mine made the point that before the Charlie Hebdo shootings, most Americans had not heard of this magazine. And most Americans, if you had put these covers in front of them, they would have said, that doesn't seem great to me. That seems a little tasteless. That seems rude. And that the act of the shooting had elevated these cartoons, unintentionally, of course, from just rude, punching down was the phrase that you used, to standing for freedom of speech in defiance of physical threats against freedom of speech. And, you know, as with the thing I was mentioning earlier with the NSA, it became a binary debate, right? Either the covers were rude and offensive, or they were important now after the attack as symbols for standing up for the right to free speech, even against mortal risks. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's both, of course, right? It can be simultaneously, you know, I look at those covers and, you know, boy, I think they're a little bit racist. But I also think that it is very important to hold up, you know, maybe even the right to racist public speech in the face of death threats against it.
Others?
I didn't identify, I mean, obviously they shouldn't be killed for drawing the cartoons either. I really like good satire, and I think that the Charlie Hebdo artists gravitated towards just mockery, and it wasn't so much about a debate of ideas or expressing ideas clearly as much as it was kind of a juvenile, they just wanted to give the finger to Islam. And so it was more about mockery, and I don't think that's a good form of satire. It's not the form of humor I prefer. So but I think of that magazine kind of like I think of the comments section, actually. Like, it's great that it's there, but I don't read it, or I have to have a couple glasses of whiskey before I read it, just because you never know what you're going to find there. I mean, I think actually that's interesting. I don't know I'd go here with this, but just to say that you're going to, whether you turn on or off a comment section, does that say something about support of free speech? Because you could argue, you know, it's just, you don't have to ever read it. You just leave the comments on. If you want to read it, you read it. If you don't, you don't. But it's giving people a voice. Yeah. I don't know.
I think in terms of the United States, we have, as you know, the First Amendment that is basically trying to prevent governmental interference. That's really what it's about. And so I think within our country, that's the role that the government really has to help stand up for freedom of speech. Globally, we have a problem with violence. We have a problem with extremist groups doing violent things against people that they don't like. And we don't have an international community that seems capable of doing anything about it. Whether it's, you know, killing all these people in a school, kidnapping 200 schoolgirls in Africa, and it's kind of like, what atrocity is enough that the world's going to come together and say, let's do something about this? And freedom of speech and intimidation of freedom of speech is just, I think, an aspect of the larger problem that we haven't addressed.
Yes. I think we have time for one more question.
Great. We have a question from Twitter from @WWhiteCWF, and he wants to know, does exercising right of free speech also require balance of civic responsibility?
It's a great question.
Yes. You're a person in the world. You have responsibilities. Yes.
I'll say this. I do think sometimes what gets lost, two issues get conflated sometimes. Do I have a right to speak? Is it what I have spoken, on the other hand, is it ethical or is it appropriate? And I think sometimes our discourse in this country is, so long as I'm on the right side of it's legal, the crassness or quality of my speech is irrelevant. And I think there is a civic responsibility to speak with some degree of appropriateness. Having said that, we have a legal system because we do not want to constrain speech where we allow more than is probably civically appropriate in many circumstances.
I think the essence, government's not going to mandate responsibility. You talk about John Le Carre after the Salman Rushdie affair in 1989 said, "There is no law in life or nature that says great religions may be insulted with impunity." Or Osama bin Laden said, "If there is no check on the freedom of your words, then let your hearts be open to the freedom of our actions." People should act responsibly, but it's not for government, at least not the United States government, to force people to act responsibly.
Well, listen, with that, I believe we come to a close, but I want to thank our panelists for a very engaging conversation. Thank you very much. And so that brings